Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this autumnal semi-abstract scene with a limited palette. I'm going to be using burnt umber, burnt sienna, indigo and paynes grey, so just 4 colours. I'm using Millford cold pressed watercolour paper. It's 100% cotton, 11 inches by 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. It's taped to my board with ordinary decorators masking tape. It's not pre-stretched, I just use it straight from the pad, and my board's at an angle of 45 degrees because I will be using the wet in wet experimental method and tipping and tilting my board, but having it at 45 degrees keeps the paint running. So I'm going to wet my page all over, having loosely sketched out a couple of simple outlines for my main trees and leaving a few dry patches so I get a bit of variation in the way the paint runs and flows on the page with some soft and hard edges. Leaving the water to soak in for about 30 seconds, I then pick up all the colours that I'm using on my brush. So that's burnt umber, burnt sienna, indigo and paynes grey, and running them across the foreground here and there using my extra large Pro Art Ron Ranson Harkey brush. It's a new brush, so I'm trying to get it worked in, and it's really nice, but it's a little bit bigger than the one that I'm used to. So I'm dotting it and dabbing it around. You can see the way the paint is running because of the angle of my board, and the thick tube consistency paint is really rich, and it's running and it's marrying and mingling and colour blending on the paper to give me these beautiful semi-abstract effects. Using what's left on my brush and then adding a little bit more burnt umber and horizontal brush strokes, just trying to get a very quiet, very simple graduated wash for my sky. I've turned my board 90 degrees, and this change of direction means the paint is now flowing in a different direction and giving me change in marks. The paint is also resisting the dry areas of paper, so I'm getting some nice textures. I've laid my board flat. That stops the wash from travelling any further, and I can just make a few little tweaks and adjustments, adding a bit more rich dark paint into my foreground here and there, just working in a very sort of intuitive, abstract way in order to try and build up something that kind of looks interesting to me. I think if you're going to be improvising and painting spontaneously, then it's really, really good to just go with your instincts as you paint. And my instincts were there to flick water onto the page into the thickest areas of paint and to spatter some inky consistency burnt sienna into the wet paint as well, and just to see what effects and textures this extra water will give me, as the water will create little tiny blossoms and blooms, which I think you can begin to see happening in the thick paint. Those weird white sort of marks running up from the bottom of the tape are quite incredible. It's just amazing what watercolour can do when it's just left to its own devices like this. Now I've just firmed up a horizon line very faintly on the left because I'm going to have some distant trees there, just painted in very faint, and I've also lifted out a pale line across the horizon, across the rest towards the right. Now I'm going to leave it to dry for a little bit, and then when the sheen has nearly gone off the paper but it's still damp, I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt into the foreground, not too much. What the salt will do is it will push the paint away. Each little grain of salt will push the paint away and should give me some beautiful sort of floral or seed heads, like autumn seed heads, thistledown, things like that effects in the foreground. I now need to leave it to dry completely. So it's all nice and dry, and I've raised the board back up to 45 degrees, and I'm really liking the way it's looking. I love the effects that the ordinary fine ground table salt has given me You could go in and add stalks and leaves and things like that to them, but I just think it's a beautiful sort of foreground filled with thistledown and autumn seed heads. So now I'm going to paint my trees. I'm going to start with the canopies at the top first, and using a size 14 synthetic mop by Escoda, I'm going to use just a mixture of Payne's grey, indigo and burnt umber, quite watery, to put in my canopies across the top where I want them, across the sort of about half to 2/3 of the page. I'm varying up the tones, trying to keep a slightly darker edge to my canopies, and then lighting it up, going in with a small damp squirrel mop to sort of soften in places. The idea is to create these sort of misty sort of structures of the tree canopies, mostly to suggest just a few leaves clinging on to the ends of the twigs, and maybe just that fine growth of twigs towards the end of the branches. Sort of just pulling the paint down a little bit in the direction of the trunks, and then once I've painted my canopies in and got enough variation and enough sort of light and dark areas, then I can leave it to dry completely, and then I'll come back and paint the tree trunks. So at the moment I'm focusing on the lost and found edges, losing some edges, finding others, and then I shall pull those trees together with a small calligraphy brush once everything's dry. So the canopy area is nice and dry, and I'm going to use a small calligraphy brush and a nice dark mixture of burnt umber, indigo and Payne's grey to paint in the trees. I'm sorry that my hand's in the way for this first part, but in a moment I'll move across to the middle trees and you'll be able to see much better how I'm painting the trees. My camera setup at the moment means that in certain places I'm afraid my hand obscures the work that I'm doing, but I think you can see that using the calligraphy brush I'm just pulling up these really fine elegant trees and branching them out so that they come up and that the finer branches meet the canopy painting that I did earlier, so that it kind of implies that sort of mass of twigs at the end of each branch and the few remaining dead leaves. So I'm bringing out some little twiggy branches as well, and this is quite a stylized way of painting trees, and I think it works well with the semi-abstract foreground that we've created. There's just enough sort of realism in these trees to be able to sort of cement the image of this autumnal abstract landscape. So you can see here I'm sort of dotting a little bit around the base of the trunks, and that's giving me the look of maybe some ivy or some creepers growing around the trees, and trying to follow my pencil lines to a certain extent. They're a useful guide because that's the size that I want my trees to be. And because I'm painting onto a dry painting, there's no time pressure for painting these branches and twigs, so you can keep stopping and stepping back and making sure that your composition looks balanced. At the moment this looks quite imbalanced because I haven't got my line of distant faint trees in behind this row, but I want to get these in first. And the reason I'm doing it this way round is because once these bolder focal point trees are in, then I can balance the tones and use the appropriate tone for the distant trees that balances out the focal point trees. Just pulling out a few little sticks and twigs coming out at slightly different levels as well. So now I've taken the same colour, but I've added an awful lot of water to it, and I'm going to paint in some trees coming up from that far horizon line in exactly the same way. But this paint is so watery, it's little more than just paint water, but it's got just enough pigment in it to create a difference in hue and tone to that of the sky behind it. So pulling up these tree trunks and branches to meet the fainter canopies that I painted across the left edge should just give us that extra little bit of depth. And where there's a little bit of water pooling up at the base of each trunk, I'm quickly dabbing that off. And of course, watercolour always dries back lighter, so these trees should just be just a suggestion of trees in the distance, and just an echo of the shapes of the sort of the mid-ground trees, which are our focal point. So I've painted more trees across the gap and just a couple more coming out, extending beyond the middle group of trees, and I think that will do. Next, I've taken a bit of really rich tube consistency burnt sienna, and I'm just going to dot and dash in and scumble in a little bit of bright deep red around the base of the trees. Not too much, I don't want it to be too showy, but what I want it to do is just to subtly draw the eye to the trees, and a little pop of bright colour will do that. And then once I've added that, I'll just go over and add a few more branches, and I think I'm going to add one more tree to the left, just to balance things out a little bit more. And here it is with the extra tree. I'm quite happy with that, but I think I need to have a look at it with fresh eyes, and so I need to remove the tape and put it against a cleaner board so that I can see it more clearly and see if it needs any final adjustments, but I think it's just about done. So here it is against a clean board, and I'm looking at it, and I think it just needs a few more dark accents and slightly different brush strokes around the trees. So what I'm doing is I'm adding little tiny dots and dashes and little lines and twigs around the base, over the trunks of the trees here and there, to sort of indicate or suggest dead leaves, vines, creepers, ivy sort of growing up these trees. So I'm going to call that finished now. I hope that was helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments. I read them all, even if I don't get time to answer them all now the channel has grown so big. Thank you so much for your support and for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you click on the bell icon, you'll be notified every time I upload a new video, and there should be a lot more like this coming up over the autumn and winter. And thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon. And happy painting. Bye.